To get started, just a quick overview of life before 1899 and how Reedsburg got here. Of course, the present site was a place of a natural crossing at the river where the Main Street Bridge is a wonderful rock bottom in the river. So native peoples like the Ho-Chunk certainly use that. The lines on the curvy lines on this drawing are the trails that cross the river right there where there was the ford. The place was then noticed and occupied by David C. Reed, the town's namesake, around 1847. It was said he had heard of iron ore in the area. That may have been a little bit further west into Ironton. He didn't find any here, but he did find this wonderful spot for water power, a rock bottom on the river where you could cross, and it would be a great place to build a dam. So he entered 200 acres at the Land Patent Office along with a man named Mr. Powell, and claimed the water power in June of 1847. Then they commenced the construction of a dam and some crude structures. Of course, the first thing to be built was a sawmill. Most of these pictures are not of Reedsburg, so I'll try and point out the ones that are. This is just a typical 18th or 19th century sawmill. Would have been something similar here. There was also several log cabins or log shanties built. They were rather crude. It was called Shanty Row. 5 of them put up about where the middle of Main Street is today, east of the river. And this was a very hard going. The winter of 1848-49 was called the starving time. So there were not a lot of people here. It was very hard to get resources, and there were stories of people being inside with an umbrella to keep the rain off of them and their children. Nonetheless, the plat of Reedsburg, or post office rather, was established in 1849 with mail being fetched from Baraboo once a week on foot. The village was platted in 1852, although a village charter was not obtained until 1868. So it grew, it was hard scrabble. It did grow, however, with the water power. Eventually a bridge was built across the river. But there was not a lot of capital, and David C. Reed was kind of floundering. So it wasn't until the Mackey brothers came in the 1850s, Joseph and Safford Mackey first, with a lot of fresh capital from New York State to buy out Reed's claim and improve things and really make a go of it. So thanks to the Mackeys for saving this little village. In 1860, the population was 461, which is smaller than North Freedom is today at about 600 people. Things really turned around when the railroad arrived in 1872. January 1st, 1872, the railroad finally arrived, coming from Baraboo and heading towards the north and west to eventually connect with Winona, Minnesota. The population in 1870, 547. The population in 1880, just 8 years after the railroad arrived, 1,331 people, an increase of 143% in 8 years. By 1900, which is the census closest to 1899, 2,225 people. So here's just a quick snapshot of the fabulous 1874 Reedsburg bird's eye drawing, so 2 years after the railroad had arrived, and you can see the full extent of the village. So with the railroad came just a lot of population, but also a lot of economic growth. There weren't a lot of brick buildings here before the railroad arrived because you had to make all the bricks locally. After it arrived, tons of bricks, literally, tons of brick buildings were built, especially downtown, and mostly for commercial buildings. So this is the closest view I think I can determine is around 1899 or thereabouts. So we still see a few more wooden buildings downtown, but fast being replaced by brick. One of the grandest buildings and closest to 1899 is the 1896 Stolte Hotel, still downtown, of course. It became an anchor and landmark in downtown Reedsburg. A fire had cleared away an earlier hotel building, and the Stoltes anteed up and built really the finest hotel in all of Sauk County. Had 39 rooms, electrically wired. Plumbing, though, is still kind of coming into vogue, so There weren't ensuite bathrooms, so I think those 39 hotel rooms shared just a few bathrooms. So they rectified that later, but it was still is and was a glorious building. And that wealth that the Stoltes had acquired from this as well as a retail operation financed the construction of 1899's finest house in Reedsburg, the William A. Stolte Jr. House, still standing, and it was fitted out with all of the modern conveniences of the time, including hot and cold running water, hot water heat, and gas and electric lights, and of course, it is still with us today. So we mentioned the newspapers, which I'm calling 1899 social media. And it's really interesting to look, as I will talk about, how much it really reflects what we see on social media today in many ways. There were two papers in 1899, the Reedsburg Times and the Reedsburg Free Press, which we know today as the Reedsburg Times Press after they were combined many years later. But communication was either by word of mouth, letters, or the newspaper. And thankfully there were two. They were both weekly. And they were often partisan. I don't know which one was more Democratic leaning or which one was more Republican leaning. It's a little more obvious in places like Baraboo, where you had the Baraboo News Republic and the Sauk County Democrat, but I haven't been able to determine which one was which here. And again, you could find everything pretty much that you would find in social media today, including things like news of weddings and funerals, long and short, notices of anniversaries. Being married 50 years was much more uncommon in those days than it is today, and a reason to be celebrated. If you were building a new house, you were often noticed in the paper as well. George Black was building a new house somewhere in town here, 2nd and Laurel Streets. You might be notified of a letter or a private message that is you haven't seen yet at the post office in the newspaper. And if you had an obnoxious neighbor that was always traveling, he would post in the paper about his fabulous trip and tell you all about where you weren't going. You could also engage in social causes in the newspaper, things like temperance. In October of 1899, you were invited to attend the temperance lecturer, Mr. Murphy, who was, quote, an eloquent Irishman who aimed at the regeneration of the drunkard rather than the mere reformation. Not sure what the difference is, but he had something in mind. Newspapers, of course, just like social media, where you could find all of everything advertised. Everything from what we call the spam today, so tonsorial parlors, a fancy term for a barbershop, how to get a patent on your invention, where to buy meat or building stone or a sewing machine. There were also ads for other newspapers, or what we would call platforms today. If you wanted to join the Weekly Inter-Ocean or the Weekly Wisconsin, you could do that with the information supplied. There was also ads for miracle cures and miracle healers, people like Dr. Brewer, a traveling specialist who was prepared to show successful treatments for all manner of ailments. Anything you can think of, he was able to allegedly cure. And if you wanted to try it yourself in the privacy of your own home, you would order some syrup of figs from the California Fig Syrup Company, which could provide a system cleanse, and was also good for colds, headaches, and fevers. If it didn't kill you, it would cure you. Also, maybe what we would call fake news, or a little bit of a stretch, interesting news at least, things like a typewriter that you simply talk into a megaphone and it's going to type out the message for you. My phone doesn't even do that quite right yet, so I can't imagine this working in 1899. And also things, public information, which we can go online today and probably ferret out, but not quite this in your face. Who's paying taxes? Who's the richest person in town? And William Stolte, whose house we just saw, paid the most in taxes personally on real estate and personal property at $221, about $8,300 today. Granted, however, there was no sales tax or federal or state income tax at the time, so allegedly his full tax duty was $8,300. Wouldn't that be nice? All right, another topic of today as well as back then, and hopefully some of these things will resonate with us and some will be completely head-scratching, but we all talk about the weather, and they certainly did back in 1899 as well. And it was a relatively typical start of January 1899, but then the cold really set in. And in those days, of course, no weather forecasts except an almanac that was just pretending, and you basically lived with no idea what was coming in the next 24 hours, let alone the next month. So the cold weather set in later January of 1899. One of the most severe cold spells, the paper noted the temp was 32 degrees below zero. And if you can imagine the insulation and heating apparatus, although coal was relatively cheap, this was nothing to be trifled with then or now. And as the cold continued, there were more problems. The water in Hay Creek Slough froze to a depth of 4 feet solid. And the paper reported happily, though, at the time that city water mains and hydrants were still faring well, but residential and business users were starting to report frozen pipes. I can only imagine. Another problem that cropped up that I had never thought about was food and the cold. And the paper noted, the weather began to moderate Monday night after 3 weeks of severe cold. Tuesday was blustering with some snow, and yesterday and today have been quite warm. The greatest damage anticipated here from the recent cold is loss of potatoes in cellars and pits. They have not yet been examined and reported on to an extent to permit any intelligent estimate of the loss thus sustained. So that was a problem. Fortunately, by mid-February, the cold had started to ease. The average temperature for the month of February was 2 below zero, the average temperature. By March, the above-ground temperatures had eased considerably, but the city was now starting to have problems with the water mains. Sometimes this happened when users along the line froze up and the water in the mains slowed, allowing it to freeze more easily. And as cold started to work its way up and out of the ground, it really affected the pipes. So the city's water superintendent, Charles Stevens, had a somewhat novel approach of hooking up high-voltage electricity to hydrants and pipes on either end of a stretch and letting electricity heat the pipes up underground, which seemed to work. So good for him as long as you could keep it safe. By mid-March, a new problem with water was emerging, this time above ground, and that was flooding from melting and rain. And the paper wrote, the loose snow that fell during the past 2 weeks softened by the warm weather. The latter part of last week melted and swelled every ravine and watercourse into a raging torrent. The sewers were stopped up and backed into many cellars. Leo Darenog's barber shop in the basement of the Kelly building was flooded 8 inches deep with water. Reed sewer as well. The slough in the western part of the city was a small lake. The sidewalk was floated away, and the Townsend Brothers sawmill was entirely surrounded, and some of the logs floated away. The railroad bridge at Reedsburg was threatened to be washed out, and a gang of men went at work all day Sunday and Sunday night trying to bake the jam of ice loose that had formed beneath the bridge. Dynamite was used to break up the ice. Nearly all the windows in the south side of the woolen mill and some in J.G. Heaton's flouring mill were broken by the concussions. The water covered the pasture south of the tracks and gave it the appearance of a lake. The woolen mills and flouring mills were unable to run Monday on account of the high water, and I would add the broken windows. Didn't help. But you did what you had to do to save the railroad bridge. Interestingly, March was more winter-like than January had been, and they had heavy snow in March, and it says the month of March seems to be the only time that we can have sleighing this winter. Snow has fallen a foot in all this week and furnished opportunity for a few days excellent slipping, and it has been very well improved. So that was fun. It also noted a heavy fall of snow last Friday night, something like 8 inches, has given us another week of sleighing. We can say quite truthfully that we have had 6 weeks of it in March this year, and that April starts in with fair sleighing in the country and about 6 feet of frost in the ground. So the farmers were probably a little nervous about that, but nothing they could do about it. The paper wrote, "This 20th day of April, 1899, finds enough of the winter's frost gone from the ground to permit plowing and seeding on light soil, though wherever litter affords a bit of protection, solid ice is yet to be found. It has been quite dry and dusty the past week, but a nice shower last night has met the desires of nearly all our farmers and will help in pulling out the frost and in the growth of winter grain and grasses that are enough alive to be helped." I can't even imagine there were any that was alive after all of that, but it says the roads have been fine, so that was helpful. The weather seemed to quiet down a little bit, although by mid-June the extreme weather was still not over. 6 inches of rain fell overnight in the area, causing considerable damage to roads and bridges and farmland. Livestock was also isolated in pastures or drowned. Mid to later June, the water was receding, leaving a different problem, which you can read there, the smell of rotting fish and plant matter. Roads and bridges were repaired. And speaking of roads and bridges, they were critical to our next topic, which is transportation. There were basically 3 ways to get yourself around in those days: yourself, the use of a horse, or the railroad. And you did that as money and adventure afforded. You could ride a bike if you were daring enough and if you could afford one. This ad stated prices for bicycles from $18.50 or $18.50 to $40. That's something like $700 to $1,500 today. If you did ride a bike, you would, of course, contend with all kinds of road conditions. There were no paved roads in Reedsburg yet, or the county at the time. Bikes were generally used for in town, but there was, surprisingly, an idea to build a bike path from Reedsburg's east side to Abelman or Rock Springs. Don't know if that was ever completed. We're still trying to get the Great Sauk Trail done to this day. So, of course, another way to get around was by horsepower. In 1899, an auto carriage or automobile had yet to be seen on the streets of Reedsburg, although they had been read about. It would be a few more years before they started to be seen, let alone available for purchase here. So the horse was king, but not everywhere. Just because every household today has one or more cars doesn't equate to every household or facility back then having its own horse. They were very expensive. They were live animals. And in fact, most people in town did not own a horse. They could be rented at a livery stable. And if you were rich enough to own a horse or horses, you most likely boarded it downtown at the livery stable. And if you were rich enough to have horses, you could afford to buy a surrey or buggy and possibly a carriage house to put it in or keep it at the livery stable. Most buggies were sold to rural families, however, who needed it to get into town. Note that this ad shows the lowest option. An open-topped road wagon is $24, which is less expensive than the most top model of bicycle. So, depending on where you wanted to put your money. But of course, the buggy did not come with a motor, the horse. So you had to buy that as well. Seaford Brothers, the advertiser here, their store can be seen in the next picture here. Great shot of downtown Reedsburg. This is the north side of the 200 block where Lorraine's Mini Mall is today. And the Seaford Brothers had a large store there where they sold farm machinery, wagons, pumps, belting, paints, and oils, basically the farm and fleet of 1899. Horses were part of the planning process of Reedsburg right from the start. When the village was platted, Main Street was made wide enough to accommodate the parking of horses and buggies, which could be quite long. Hitching posts and rails were part of the streetscape. And as you can see on the left, the horse is wearing a net to keep the biting flies at bay. And ironically, unfortunately, we have almost the identical shot in the wintertime. Seaford Brothers again across the street, and we see how buggies and wheeled vehicles have given way to horse and sleigh. The fly netting has been replaced with horse blankets. If you look closely at the Seaford Brothers building there just to the left of the awning that's down, in the window you can see bicycles hanging up in the window being advertised for sale. Other retailers sold all kinds of things for your horse, and I love this ad Horses don't like shabby harness any more than you like shabby clothes. They'd undress right before this store and insist on having something new. In order that the horses hereabouts may have a new dress, we are going to offer you the best harness to be found in the market at a lower price than it can be bought for anywhere in Reedsburg. Other retailers tried to lure in customers with creature comforts, not only for themselves but for their horses. The firm of Stolte, Dangle, and Foss built a 3,400 square foot shed to accommodate customers that were coming to town or in town with their horse and buggy. So covered parking, let's say, for that store. And just like today, modern car accidents, there were plenty of accidents with horse and buggy. These were live animals that could be easily spooked. There was a classic occurrence in October of 1899 when two buggies collided. There was a rather exciting collision on Vine Street near Donohue's livery stable last Sunday afternoon. E.C. Johnson and C.S. Smith were driving along that street, and when near the livery stable, they were met by a horse and buggy being driven by a young man from North Delona. As the two rigs were passing, the latter's horse became frightened at something and jumped to one side, causing the hind wheel of his vehicle to become locked with the hind wheel of Mr. Johnson's buggy. The shock broke the whiffletree of the young man's buggy, and the horse got free. The young man was thrown out and sustained quite a painful but not a serious wound on his head. His horse was soon caught by bystanders. Neither Mr. Johnson nor Smith sustained any injuries. Apparently they had the heavier vehicle. That would be a typical occurrence every once in a while, at least here in Reedsburg. Travel between communities could be done by horse and buggy, but it was often done by rail, at least to those communities that had a railroad connection. This didn't always mean riding the train, however. Many people walked between communities on or near the tracks. They were level, clear paths, and that could be done. But of course, the best way to do that and most comfortable way was to buy a seat on a passenger coach. And ever since the railroad arrived January 1st, 1872, Reedsburg had a connection to the rest of the United States by rail with the Great Chicago and Northwestern Line. It was a single line between Madison and Winona, Minnesota. It was so successful, however, that by the mid-1890s it was being double-tracked. This provided one dedicated track going north and one going south, kind of like an interstate. Didn't have to worry about cross traffic or pulling trains off on sidings to let others pass. And this timetable from 1899 shows 5 passenger trains a day, at least, coming through Reedsburg from each direction, with some trains leaving daily at 3 a.m. in the morning. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad had thousands of miles of track in 1899 and could get you to many places where you could hop on another carrier. They also offered special excursions to places near and far. You could take a special excursion train to the modern Woodman's Picnic at Baraboo, or to the big Sparta Fair. There were excursion rates to anywhere in the country, basically, special rates to go to New York City or out to the west. So it really was life-changing when the railroad arrived. It also came with its share of danger. There was a very heavily used crossing still there on Main Street, although now abandoned, but right across the bridge was the crossing, and when it was double-tracked, it was even more dangerous, and unfortunately there was a sad accident in the fall of, or late 1899, when Viola Schultes was struck by a train at the Main Street crossing. I think she was 17, or some say 15 years old, and she was reading a letter or some paper and did not notice the approaching train. Does that sound familiar, as we're all staring at our phones, walking around? So you got to be careful. She was thrown 30 feet and down a bank. A crowd soon gathered, and she was picked up and taken to S.A. Collins' marble shop, where Doctors Rude and Coordinate were immediately summoned. They found no broken bones immediately, but she had obviously suffered some traumatic injuries, including to her head, Fortunately, later papers stated that she was improving, although sadly she did die about 5 years later, and there was some indication that part of it was due to lingering effects of this accident. And she never really went back to school after this. She was in 8th grade when she was struck. So that was a little sad story. All right, let's talk about the downtown, the heart of the city, where virtually all retail, service sector, and even some industry at the time could be found. It was the heart of the city. There really wasn't any other commercial areas to be found. Everything was downtown. And a person from 1899, I think, would still recognize a lot of the buildings that we see in modern-day downtown Reedsburg. Most of them on this picture, the brick ones, are still with us. And you can see the Stolte Hotel there on the far back right side downtown. Sanborn maps were done in 1898, giving us a great snapshot just about perfectly for 1899, showing the stores that were downtown. The pink buildings are brick and the yellow buildings are wood, slowly being replaced as fire or their removal would have it. And this is the west half of Main Street. There's at least 7 saloons noted on the map, as well as plenty of other stores, hardware stores, general stores, an opera hall on the second floor of a building on the north side, billiard halls, steam laundry. And on the west or east half of Main Street, almost what we see today had already been built by 1899. One little wooden building there on the south side of the street yet to be replaced. Interestingly, no saloons on this block. I'm not sure why. First floor space was almost always retail. Second floor space could be meeting halls for lodges like the International Order of Oddfellows, the Masons, or offices for doctors, lawyers, etc. There was even some manufacturing downtown. If you look closely, the top right, there's a cigar factory on the second floor of that building. And the base, or the first floor, is a carriage repository. Seaford Brothers, actually. The north side of the 200 block of Main Street had some of the most beautiful cornices in all of Sauk County, an impressive row of about 7 pressed metal cornices. I think we have 4 of the 7 left today, which should be fiercely protected. And there you can see some of the stores, mercantile, bank, jewelry store, so on. There's relatively few interior pictures from that time period. That was still kind of coming in hand, but we do have a few. An interior of a restaurant, possibly at one of the hotels here in Reedsburg. A meat market with the freshest of meats, where you could pick out what you wanted. And the Mueller and Dangle drugstore, where some ladies around the 4th of July have received some advertising gimmicks, some paper fans, and some paper hats that they're proudly wearing for this picture. But by far the biggest store was literally the big store, the downtown Walmart of 1899. This was the largest retail store in Sauk County. Webb and Schwecke, Herbert H. Webb and the Schwecke brothers started this in 1883. They called it the Boys Store at the time. In 1886, they purchased the corner lot of Main and Walnut, and for $1,000 started the first building, which was expanded greatly. Originally first floor store and second floor offices, but I think eventually all retail with that massive addition to the north, which was done in 1896, and if you look closely, extends over the alley. So you could still use the alley, but you drove under and through the store. And the Sanborn map illustrates that a little more distinctly. You can see it on the bottom right, the general store, the original portion. Then we're going over the alley with the drive, and then this massive addition to the back of the big store at really 3 levels, 2 above ground and the basement. So to get to the back of the store, you either went up and over or down and under to get to the back of the store, or you went outside. Of course, they were constantly advertising. Here's one of their ads from the day. You could get everything they said from cradle to grave. You could get a good mattress for only $2.50, which is about $95 today. Maybe good is a strong term. You could get a mattress. Ironically, that's less than the price of the top pair of men's shoes right next door. So not sure what was going on there. Fortunately, we have some great pictures of the interior of the big store, probably a little later than 1899, but you get the point. Showing the store where usually everything was, you requested something and then it was brought to you, to the counter. So there are stools there where you could wait while you got served, and they brought it to you. So we see some textiles and fabrics there. Also the great stairs going up and over to the back of the store. Another view showing, again, probably more textiles, maybe finished ready-made clothing. And that back portion of the store, which was a vast open room, showing everything, pots and metal cookware in the foreground. Above that, bird cages hanging. Right behind it, horse and buggy, and you see other things in the background. And an opposing view from the same room, showing the buggies in the foreground and the bird cages and everything in the back. See all kinds of items there. One more view showing the furniture area, tables, chairs, framed artwork. I thought that was rather interesting. This was the home goods of its day, with framed artwork and mirrors, bedsteads, baby buggies. They also sold groceries, but they got into a little trouble. Last week, a warrant was issued for the firm of Webb and Schweckes, charging them with keeping open on Sunday. They were fined $5 and costs. This is only a gentle reminder of the Sunday law, which prohibits the sale of everything on Sunday but the necessities of life. It has not been considered anything out of the way for a farmer coming in town Sunday to do his trading and thus save another trip, but the influence is bad and will lead others to do the same thing. There are others, for instance, a person happening to glance up an alley on Sunday afternoon can see from 3 to 4 men, generally headed by the proprietors, making for the back door of a saloon. This is a thing that is against the moral of any town and should be attended to first. Our barber shops were kept open on Sunday until about a year ago, and since that time the law has been observed pretty well by them. One thing, however, may be noticed, and that is about closing Saturday night at 12 o'clock. It is just as much Sunday, 1 minute after 12 o'clock, as it is the next morning. It will probably be attended to in the future by our officers. If we intend to observe Sunday at all in Reedsburg, let it be done according to law and from a moral standpoint. Of course, there were other retailers besides the big store. One of their biggest competitors was Stolte's, Dangle, and Foss on the right side there. You could buy anything in town, downtown, from an ice cream freezer to a custom-made hat to the latest style of underwear. Inflation was also a thing, though, even back then. And the drugstore had a little run-in with the paper. The proprietors of the city drugstore fountains have opened for the season and offer an extra chill with every ice cream soda by charging 8 cents for it. Experience has taught them that there is no profit in it at the old price of a nickel. One thing that Reedsburg did not have at the start of 1899 was a paved main street. It was still largely dirt with maybe some oiled gravel. So it was decided to put down pavers in 1899. This would mean other improvements too, like wider sidewalks in front of the stores. And there was some question as to what to do with the hitching posts and rails due to their appearance downtown. One suggestion was to move them to the streets around the nearby city park or city square, and this meant with some serious contempt. In an anonymous letter to the editor, the stupidity of the idea was decried with force and sarcasm. Editor, Free Press, in your issue of August 3rd, it was suggested that our city council in its infinite wisdom might decide to erect the hitching posts, formerly a useful adjunct on Main Street, around the public square. Let's see, said square is supposed to be an ornament, a breathing place and resort for our inhabitants, with the chevaux de frise of hay wagons, wood racks, and other bucolic movables with their concomitants of stamps, horses, and mule squeals and brays, flies, litter, loose hay, and feed, through which and around which the pedestrians and lovers of the beauty and solitude of the park must wander, climb, run, and dodge, it is supposed that nothing further could be suggested to add to the aesthetic features of our little park, unless it could be a little mowing of the grass, a little trimming of the trees, and the setting out of trees where needed. In the meantime, our mayor and common council need not retire to the jungles of our once pretty park for quiet, but Main Street will be quiet enough for anyone, and the raucous call of the mare for its colts, or the impatient stamp of a fly-bitten bobby, will disturb no one's slumber, and every day will be Sunday on Main Street. That probably caught some attention, and they decided to put up hitching posts again on Main Street after it was paved. So in September of 1899, work began on laying down the hundreds of thousands of bricks needed to pave Main Street. And this is one photo which we can absolutely identify as 1899, because this is October of 1899 on Main Street, 125 years ago. The work started at the bridge and proceeded east. Within 2 weeks, it was completed from the bridge to Walnut Street. The crew paused for this picture 125 years ago when they were doing the next block. Note the men in the back are sitting in their wheelbarrows for the photo. Probably sat in them for lunch as well. So it was a great improvement to downtown Reedsburg, and the work was done in plenty of time for the holiday season, which was coming up. Now, the holiday season, when I say that, did not start until December 1st, mercifully, unlike today, where it starts about July 1st. There were no Christmas ads until after December 1st. All the stores downtown that had special advertising and promotions advertised in the paper, such as Santa Claus headquarters at the S. Ramsey and Company in the Hotel Stolte block. Stolte, Dangle, and Foss, of course, also advertised. Some offerings for the kids included fur muffs and collarettes. The most expensive set cost $2.50. That would be $94 today. The cheapest was a 65-cent muff and collarette, which would be $24 today. But you could get your kid a 5-cent picture hanky for 5 cents, and it would be about $1.90. You could get kid leather gloves for the wife for $1, or about $38 today. Christmas trees could, of course, be cut if you had access to some out in the country. And I was surprised to see an advertisement, though, that there were some shipped in from up north and on sale here in Reedsburg in December of 1899. These would generally have been tabletop versions. They were much smaller than many today. And this is very typical for directions or for decorations. It looked, like the kids just threw it on the tree. Usually toys and small gifts were tucked into the tree itself, and it became an item to be dismantled on Christmas Day. There were other holidays, Easter, Memorial Day, 4th of July, but not as many as there are today, certainly. Memorial Day involved a procession from downtown to the city park, where a service was held, and then a procession formed again and walked several blocks to the cemetery at the north edge of town, where graves were decorated and remarks made, along with a volley from the militia company. The 4th of July involved a parade out to the fairgrounds, followed by an hour-long speech, followed by a flag drill from the Women's Relief Corps, and then a picnic. Horse racing in the afternoon was followed by a sham battle put on by old veterans recreating parts of the Spanish War, followed by a baseball game between Baraboo and Reedsburg. Reedsburg won in 1899. And of course, fireworks were everywhere throughout the day. Halloween was also celebrated. I don't believe they did much trick-or-treating, if any. Usually it was a night to play pranks. Fortunately, 1899 was rather quiet. And speaking of the kids, all those young boys were most likely students in the Reedsburg School District, and they had some issues very much like today. In February of 1899, the newspaper posted an article which read, in part, "Parents are earnestly requested to give increased attention to the records that their children are making in school. Examine their report card and promotion card carefully. Talk about them. Where there is a low mark in scholarship or deportment, inquire into the cause. Find time to visit the departments in which you have children enrolled. The problem of education is a more serious one than the tariff problem, the money problem, or the expansion problem. You cannot render your boy or girl a greater service than by taking a special interest in their schoolwork. Teachers will be glad to meet you and explain their plans and methods. Their work will be more effective with your sympathy, cooperation, and help. The attention of parents who have pupils attending the high school is called to the number of cases of tardiness that we had during the last quarter. What can we do to eradicate this? So many of the same topics and issues that we would have today. Those high schoolers included all of 16 students. They attended class in Reedsburg's old school building, at the time becoming very old and certainly too small. It was noted on April 1st of 1899. The storm windows have been removed, and we again enjoy the luxury of fresh air, which has been a scarce article for several months. Probably getting pretty ripe in there. A joint debate between the seniors and juniors will occur tomorrow evening at the high school building. The question to be debated is resolved that immigration into the United States should not be restricted. So again, we're still talking about it. But the building was the graduating class of 1899. This was their class yell, "You rah rah, you rah rhine." Reedsburg High School, 99. You rah rah, you rah rhine. We're the class of 99. By the following fall, when school was winding up again, it was noted in the paper that there were very few seats left. The school was, even with only 16 students in the graduating class, the whole building was serving a lot more students than that. High school was not mandatory, but if you wanted your kid to be in high school, you needed to get your application in with preference given to city residents versus those trying to enroll from outside of the community. And it would be another couple years before a new glorious large high school was built here in Reedsburg. Little quick talk about industry. Of course, the elephant in the room was the Reedsburg Woolen Mill, first built in 1882 to take advantage of the water power right there at the end of Main Street. Office building, which is still with us, was built in 1890-91. And the rest of the mill was added on to over the years with extensive additions in the 1890s. So this is much of how it would have looked in 1899. Certainly the largest employer in the city. Nearby was the Shephorster Stave Mill, another large industry located between the Baraboo River and the railroad tracks. Staves are the curved sides of barrels. Everything was shipped in barrels at the time, from flour to hardware. If you could fit it in a barrel, you shipped it that way. Somebody had to make the barrels, and somebody had to make the parts for the barrels. So here in Reedsburg, it was a large business making barrel staves and tops, which were shipped off elsewhere by rail to barrel makers. And unfortunately, that had a fire in 1899, which destroyed the whole thing for Mr. Shephorster. $5,000 worth of damage, and he had no insurance. Typically, insurance could cost more than just trying to gamble and see if you could make it. Not sure if he rebuilt, but the article went on to say that he was going to rebuild smaller if he did. So that was a loss for Reedsburg in 1899. Now this next section was probably the funnest to discover, and I'm calling it mayhem. Some little incidents that happened around Reedsburg in 1899. We'll start at the depot. March 1899. Hugh Wise was unexpectedly cut by flying glass last Saturday night. While he was on duty at the depot, two strangers began fighting on the platform just outside the office. He stood by the window watching them when they suddenly fell against the window. The flying glass struck Hugh, cutting him on the face and hands quite badly in some places. July 1899 at the depot. The automatic gum machine in the ladies' waiting room at the depot was burglarized one night, the first of the week, the gum and pennies being stolen. The company owning the machine has authorized Station Agent Willie to offer a reward of $25 for information that will lead to the conviction of the thief. That's a lot of gum for $25. Near downtown, while playing at the south end of Market Street last evening, Paul Black received a severe shock by touching a downhaul wire from an electric light. It is not known exactly how the wire became charged, but when he took hold of the ring by which it is hooked to the pole, he was unable to let go. A companion pulled him off, but he had lost consciousness, and for a time it was thought he was dead. A customer was examining a Winchester rifle in Seaford Brothers hardware store on Tuesday afternoon when, to the amazement of all in the vicinity, there was an explosion and a bullet went through a plate glass, through a window in Gulliford's store across the street, through a partition, and embedded itself in the rear wall of the building. Some person who had been examining the gun, curious perhaps to know whether it was of the right caliber, had inserted a shell and neglected to remove it. Speaking of shooting, complaints are frequently received of careless shooting by hunters returning from the woods as they get near the city. It is common practice for them, for instance, to stop on the railroad just west of the city and shoot north over the river. They seem to forget entirely the fact that workmen are nearly always engaged in that direction. Yesterday, a rifle ball fired in this manner passed through the coat which John Krug, who works for Mr. Ellenwood, was carrying on his arm. There was also occupational danger everywhere. While workmen were at work excavating for the sewer on Market Street Wednesday afternoon, a cave-in occurred and John Stewart was covered by the falling earth. Only the quick kind of work saved his life, and as it was, he was unconscious when taken out. He was taken to the office of the Morgan Building and Lumber Company, and Dr. Rood summoned. The injured man was not restored to consciousness for about half an hour. He was later taken to his home on the west side in a very weak condition as a result of his terrible experience. Later developments indicate that Mr. Stewart has suffered some internal injuries. While William and Louise Schultz were driving home last evening, their wraps caught fire from a cigar, but was not noticed as they were driving into the wind and the flames were carried backwards. Thomas Brimmer noticed the trouble as they passed his place and helped to extinguish the flames. The blankets were badly burned, and Louis Schultz's overcoat was ruined. Now, this next one was literally shocking. We believe there has never been a time in the history of our city when bawdy houses have been so numerous as at present, or when the inmates have plied their vocations so publicly and offensively. We do not care to dilate upon the subject and call attention to it because we believe it for the public's good and because it is time for the city officials to take vigorous action to expel from our midst such characters as are flagrantly violating the laws of our land and shocking the sensibilities of residents in the infested districts. And speaking of more ne'er-do-wells, this is the old fire department, and on the back end was a city jail called the Calaboose. Some tough citizens picked up a horse thief, fighting drunks, and common hobos gathered in. 3 drunken tramps whom Marshal Metcalf placed in the city jail last Tuesday gave a good exemplification of the helplessness of organized society as against irresponsible vagabonds. They had all kinds of fun at the expense of the public and smashing the windows of the jail, breaking the stoves and bedding, jamming up the stovepipe, and ruining everything possible for them to lay their hands on. Mr. Metcalf called on Deputy Sheriff Craker to assist in subduing the inmates, but moral suasion is of but little avail in such a case. On Wednesday morning, Justice Smith sentenced them to 60 days in the county jail, and Constable E.G. Stolte took them there. Officers of law are privileged, and it is their duty to use such force as may be necessary to quiet violent persons in their charge. In the case under discussion, a stream of water from a hose or a biff over the head with a club would have been justifiable, and the prisoners could then have been handcuffed and closely confined until their hearing. A more rigid treatment of such offenders would lessen the number of such offenses. All right, and one more. Now get this. Edward Ferris, the 5-year-old son of Mrs. John Cuff, last Saturday climbed into the sleigh of David Bryden, standing on the streets, and covered himself up in the hay in the bottom of the box. He supposed he was riding around town, but on getting up found himself in the village of Ironton. Mr. Bryden telephoned to Mrs. Cuff, and she went the same evening with a livery team and brought the boy home. There's so many layers there. I don't know where she thought her 5-year-old was, but anyways. Okay, last topic, entertainment. Of course, there was no radio, no television, but there was community and there was performance. And there were always something going on. There was an opera house downtown. It could be a program put on by the Women's Relief Corps with songs about the Civil War and their histories. It could be a spelling contest to raise money for the new library, in fact, and the chance to win a quilt. There was also organized sports like a June baseball game between the clerks of rival stores, the Big Store and Stolte, Dangle, and Foss. It was said that the soft-muscled, white-faced boys perspired freely through the 7 innings. The final score was 35-41. Baseball, 35-41. That's a lot of running. The next morning, the paper said, brought limps, soreness, and sunburn. Entertainment also came through Trown, but not always with the best effect. Traveling shows could bring entertainment, but it was a buyer beware basis, as with the traveling production of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1899 in July. And it said, this show made money. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin Company took considerable money out of our city last Thursday evening, and we doubt if they left its equivalent in legitimate entertainment. Their tent holds over 1,000 persons, and it was crowded. That's like half the population. In fact, many were turned away, unable to get in because there was no room. After getting in, the attendant was solicited to give up 10 cents additional for a reserved seat to get a good place to sit, and even then the reserved seats were very uncomfortable. There was no good talent in the company, and their spiritless, uncomprehending efforts added to the agony of the audience. Better things were promised in an afternoon concert for 10 cents, and many of a gambling proposition stayed, hoping to play even. They were promised the best concert they had ever seen or their money back. Very poor concerts are sometimes given after circus performances, but we think most of those who stayed Thursday night were entitled to the return of their money, even though they didn't ask for it. So. Local entertainment was guaranteed usually to be far better, and in 1899, Reedsburg started what was to be an annual Reedsburg Fair in a fairgrounds on the west side that Mr. Ellenwood owned, and this would be much like the county fair. There were prizes for all kinds of submitted products, and racing as well was to be had at the Reedsburg and Baraboo Valley Agricultural Society Fair. I don't know how long that lasted, but it obviously did not go on forever. And lastly, if you wanted a little bit of outside camaraderie and entertainment and do-goodery, you could join a club. And the paper listed the society directory for 1899, and of course this is on top of church as well. We had the Odd Fellows, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Masonic Lodge, the Workman Lodge, never heard of that, the Woodman Lodge, Woodmen of the World, and the Knights of Pythias. You could all join those. There were also other grassroots efforts, including the start of the public library in early 1898. The year before we finally got a library, there was meetings at the Opera House with Miss Ellie Stearns of the State Library Commission, who was a cheerleader for starting a public library here, and said, without seeming to urge the matter, the speaker left in the minds of her hearers a conviction that it was their duty to bestir themselves and determine if the hour had not already arrived when Reedsburgers should have a public library and reading room. And of course, you know, the rest is history. So congratulations to the Reedsburg Public Library on their 125th anniversary today.